This is part one of a semester review for the class Assessment, Evaluation, and Reflection in Educational Settings. This class covers primarily the Kirkpatrick model of evaluating learning. And in the first video, we'll do an overview, and then subsequent videos will go through each different level of the Kirkpatrick model. So to start off with, you have to ask yourself why you would do evaluation and what is it. Evaluating learning is an incredibly important part of understanding the outcomes and whether the investment of learning has been worth it. Investment meaning not just financial, but time and effort to see if students have actually gained new skills, new attitudes, or new knowledge. Three important questions to ask yourself at the beginning of this process is what does it mean to shoot for quality training, to have a goal of delivering high quality educational experiences? And then of course you have to know how to measure it. The definition of measuring learning is sometimes difficult to pin down. So we'll break that down by different learning, by different stage and different levels. And then, of course, how do you improve that training? The training and learning and education that happens, one of the primary reasons for evaluating is so that you can continuously improve it and make it better and more effective. So when we think about why we need to evaluate, I just mentioned that we want to improve the program, and that's a key element. That's really the student-centered perspective. But there are also other reasons. One is that we want to make sure that we have maximized the organization's results. In other words, that we are tailoring the training to the outcomes that we desire, and it's having an impact on the results of an organization, and also demonstrating program value. When we talk about this, it sounds more like having evidence that can justify continued investment in a training or education program. And this bleeds over into traditional education settings as well. Evaluation is always an integral part of an instructional design process. The 4 levels of evaluation apply to a traditional education setting as well as a professional development setting. And that's an important takeaway. Some of the measurements in terms of measuring behavior and measuring results can be a little bit more difficult to evaluate in traditional educational settings because of the tradition that students move on from class to class or from grade level to grade level. But it can still be done on the basis of measuring it within an actual course from start to finish. And lastly, information from the evaluation at all 4 levels of the Kirkpatrick model are important to recalibrating the instruction and the learning so that it can be improved time and time again, just as we talked about in a more general professional development setting. So you may recall early in the course we talked about the percentage of formal learning that's actually applied to the job. This is formal training that gets applied. In 1975 it was 15%, and by 2005 it was approximately 15%. The research shows that there just hasn't been much change from that during that time span in the amount of formal learning that's actually applied to the job. So you have to ask yourself, what were the big causes? In one of the subsequent studies, the Brinkerhoff study, very few people actually achieved sustained new behaviors. Most people did not try new skill. Many people did not try the skills. Most people tried them and failed. So in the case of training failure, what we learned was that 70% of the causes of training failure are related directly to the learning and intervention models and effectiveness of those interventions. Only 20% was related to preparation and readiness, and 10% to the application environment where they could actually apply their learnings. More statistics about learning and transfer to the job in general. Another study shows that less than 10% of training expenditures actually result in transfer to the job. Think about that for a minute and imagine what that means for a company that's trying to train its staff to be effective at whatever the job is, whether it's a service industry or whether it is a manufacturing or product industry. It doesn't matter. If you're wasting 90% of your training expenditures and only 10% is making an impact on the job, then something needs to improve. And if your evaluation program and assessment protocols are strong, you can greatly improve this percentage. So as we look at timing of evaluations, this will be more clear later when we talk about the 4 different levels. But prior to beginning an education or training program, we need to do a knowledge assessment. And before even designing one, we do a needs assessment, and I'll talk about that in an upcoming slide. But the needs assessment leads to a knowledge assessment, and that happens prior to the teaching environment or training taking place. Then there's evaluation of reaction and evaluation of learning. That's level 1 and level 2 in the Kirkpatrick model, and that takes place during the education program. And then after that completes, then the Kirkpatrick model shows and leads us to evaluate behavior and ultimately to evaluate results. But in terms of a chronological timeline, the knowledge assessment happens before or perhaps at the beginning of the training period. Then reaction and learning can be evaluated throughout a training program, and then behavior and results come afterwards. So when we look at the 4-level model, Kirkpatrick identifies level 1 as reaction. This is your first response. It's a little bit like a customer satisfaction index. It's the degree to which participants find the training favorable, engaging, and relevant. And it's important that you ask about relevancy for reasons that we've discussed in class and that you'll see again in the review videos later. But up from level 1 comes from reaction comes the evaluation of learning, level 2. The degree to which participants acquire the intended knowledge, skills, or attitudes. Level 2 learning is more sophisticated than level 1 reaction, and it's more directly associated with the training itself, not external factors like the time of day that the training was conducted or the comfort level of the room or some of the things that we'll talk about when we discuss level 1 reaction. But after you've evaluated learning, then you can move to evaluating behavior, and fourth comes results. And these are the final objectives. In other words, the reasons why you're doing the training in the first place. It's to effect some kind of change in an organization. And if you don't achieve those results, you have to look back at level 3 behavior, and if that's not showing indications of positive momentum, then you have to look at learning and so forth. Throughout the use of the Kirkpatrick model, we're collecting data, and this data collection creates a chain of evidence that you can use to understand the next level up and ultimately to understand how effective the results are, or what the net results have been that come from the training itself. And that chain of evidence is helpful in a corporate setting because it can justify or be used to justify continued investment in training activities, or it can be used to refine how you're making investments with the training dollars that you have. So we start by looking at the end. The end is the beginning, and the question to ask is, what do you want to accomplish? In an organizational setting, it can be any number of things. If it's a sales organization, the end might be increased profits. It might be increased employee retention. In an educational setting, it might be higher numbers of graduates. In a manufacturing setting, it might be reducing the number of injuries and lost work time events on the manufacturing floor. It might be increasing safety. So you have to ask, what is it that you want to accomplish? This establishes the goal, and that goal is the result level that you're shooting for. And from there, you can backtrack and understand more about what kind of teaching and learning needs to happen to promote the behaviors that are necessary to achieve the result. So at the bottom level, we talked about reaction. Just briefly, it's been introduced. I'll go through that in more detail in a later video, and each of these levels will have their own video. But basically, the question is, to what degree do participants react favorably to the training? That's the reaction level. Learning level, to what degree do the participants acquire the intended knowledge, skills, and abilities, or attitudes? After you've evaluated learning, you can evaluate behavior. To what degree do participants apply what they've learned during the training when they're back on the job? So this is actually using or attempting to use what they have learned. So there has been some actual behavioral change. And the fourth level, to what degree do targeted outcomes occur as a result of the training or learning events and the following reinforcement? This is really important that we don't lose sight of this. It is harder than evaluating level 1 reaction and level 2 learning, because results can come a long time after the training. But it is an important part of closing the continuous evaluation process. So we talked about these things being sequential, from level 1 to level 2 to level 3, and level 3 to level 4. You can read what these target. But one thing to remember about evaluation processes, the methodology is very clear. The methodology is flexible but very clear, and it can be borrowed from place to place or from learning situation to learning situation when those are similar. You can borrow the evaluation forms, you can borrow the learning assessments, you can borrow a lot of the tools and be inspired by them to make your own. But what you can't borrow is the outcome. The results of a training and learning situation are unique, and they only apply to your organization's specific circumstances. So you can't borrow the results. If somebody else has implemented a training assessment program and you implement exactly the same training assessment program, your results will not necessarily look anything like the results of those other in that other circumstance. So the question is, where do we start? And we will start by looking at the original recommendations, 10-step plan to implementing effective training programs. We start off with determining needs, and then it goes through until we're evaluating the program. When we talk about determining needs, there are many ways to do so. We can ask the participants themselves, we can ask the bosses, managers, and supervisors of those participants. We can ask experts or other people that are familiar with the job what's necessary for success in that position. You can test the participants and see what they know, and by default knowing what they need, learning what they need to know. You can look at performance appraisal forms. You can look at new textbooks or new policies that come out with new ways of doing things and compare that with your existing training program. So these are just some ways to determine needs. So how do you ask the students or participants? We spent some time going through this and discussing the merits of surveying them or interviewing them. Individuals or small groups are fine to conduct an interview with, and a survey can be broadcast either on paper or online to large numbers of people. So each one has benefits and drawbacks. The benefits of surveys are that they can be fast, inexpensive, and they can reach a large number of people. One of the drawbacks is that you're at risk for having questions that are not appropriate, that are not well thought out, that don't give you complete information, or that don't allow the recipients to generate new ideas of their own if you didn't direct them to answer specific questions about that on the survey. And a benefit of interviews is the free-flowing, interactive nature of an interview allows you to discuss and discover more information than could be gained on a survey. The obvious drawback, though, is that they're time-consuming and therefore they're also expensive, and you can't scale them up. It's also sometimes challenging to conduct those for people that are in wide geographic areas at the same time. At the beginning of our semester, we filled out this form, and this was our class survey, which asked you to talk about the different types of things you needed to learn more about. I encourage you to go back and reread that form. Everybody should have one. And if you don't have one, see me in class. But the class survey was a method of determining your learning needs at the beginning of this course. And so we had an opportunity to tailor it as you went through the semester. So one of the discussion topics was what topics should be presented to meet the needs and what are the limitations. Specifically, once we know what your needs are, and that came from a more detailed evaluation of the needs survey, but once you know what your trainees' needs are, then you have to start converting those into training and learning topics. So what topics should actually be presented or trained on? The next step in creating effective training programs is asking who is the audience. And the guiding question there is to ask yourself what populations actually benefit from the training. Those are going to be the targets for the academic program. If they are people who are able to change behaviors themselves and then go on with those new behaviors and achieve the organization's goals in the results area, then these are the ideal people to have in training. Now, sometimes you can have people in training because they have a duty to learn certain information. For example, when legal circumstances change, when there's policies or external requirements from maybe an accreditor or something else, whenever that sort of external situation changes and it requires a new set of behaviors, then that might automatically define who actually needs to get training. So for example, if there was a new law for financial responsibility or accounting disclosures that was implemented, the people at the organization who are responsible for compliance with regulations and financial laws, they would automatically be the likely targets to go for additional training and education about these new laws. Should training be made compulsory or should it remain volunteer training? And the answer to that, of course, depends on the circumstances in the organization. There are some cultural considerations, and there are some considerations of the importance of the training material. So cultural considerations might be that at a certain level within the hierarchy, it's considered optional, but at a lower level, perhaps it's considered mandatory. There might also be the importance of the training material relative to the person who might learn it. There might be a small group of people for whom this information is very important, and for them it might be mandatory. And then there might be a larger circle of people for whom this information or this knowledge might be helpful, but it's not part of their day-to-day duties, and it might not be useful for them in a daily basis. So perhaps those people would be invited to attend, but their attendance could be optional or voluntary. Another step in designing effective training programs is deciding how to segregate the participants. You can do this by hierarchy or level within the organization. You can do it by function, or you can do it in other ways. There might be a geographic participation, a geographic grouping. There might be a business unit grouping, where everybody who works in the manufacturing plant for one type of product is grouped together, and everybody who works in a different manufacturing plant for a different product works in a different set of trainings. So there are many ways to decide what are the right groups of participants, but you have to also ask yourself, how do you separate them from one another, and is it even important that you do so? Scheduling is the next phase of creating effective training programs, and the ideal time frame considers the needs of the trainee and the needs of the supervisors, bosses, and managers. And it overlays in there the third consideration, which is when are the best conditions for learning. And by that I mean, what time of day, what day or week out of the month, is there a month during the year that is typically heavier workload or a lighter workload, and should you try to get your training into that time span, or perhaps hold it until things calm down a little bit later? So there are considerations for when the best time is, but the balance is between the trainee's needs and the needs of the organization. And with the conditions of learning being that third factor, you can get a really best possible case in terms of when to hold the training, but it does take purposeful consideration. You can't just accidentally make it ideal. So you need to look at those three considerations. We just talked about that. So another part is creating a learning environment that is supportive and that is positive for the learner and for the message and for the types of materials that are being presented. And this includes very specific sets of considerations, like is it a convenient location? Is it a place where learners can be comfortable? Is it necessary for that learning to happen at the workplace, or can it happen off-site? Are there technical needs? For example, if your learners are learning a dental procedure, then it's probably necessary for them to be in a room that has the appropriate dental equipment to work on mannequins, or to potentially work on patients, or to learn those skills. So there could be lots of different considerations to facilities needs. If you're in a manufacturing plant, then perhaps some training is in a classroom, and some training might take place out on the manufacturing floor, or in a warehouse. Likewise, it could be out amongst all the products. So there is no one right place or facilities definition for proper learning environment. As the person who's developing the training, you have to make choices about what is the best and optimal choice available to you, and then pursue that. As a person who's defining and creating the training, you also have to recruit a trainer. Sometimes that will be you, but sometimes it won't be. And you need to find the right trainer who can teach that material to this specific audience. And the idea here is that square pegs don't fit into round holes. If you're teaching something that's extremely practical and hands-on, for example, perhaps you need a trainer who has actually done it, and not just somebody who has read about it in a book someplace or watched a few videos. So you've got to try to find the right trainer for the circumstances, for the audience, and for the training material that all surround this specific training that you're trying to plan. And then there's a consideration of the right kinds of visual aids. Visual aids can communicate and they can maintain interest on the part of the learners. We watched a video in class, and I'll put a link to the video here so you can click over to it. But I encourage you to re-watch this. It's a short video, and it talks about making the right choices. And then there's the matter of coordinating the whole thing. So when you know what your audience needs are, you have an idea of when the ideal timing would be, you know what the best possible learning environment could be, you've identified a trainer who actually coordinates all of this. There are times when the trainer or the instructor coordinates it, and there are times when there's an external coordinator that also takes that responsibility, and so the instructor focuses exclusively on teaching and training and student learning. So that's a question for your organization to consider as well. And finally, the 10th step in that list of steps to create effective training programs is evaluation of the program itself. And that's the subject of the entire course. And so we will begin in the next video by looking at evaluating reaction, which is level 1 in the Kirkpatrick model.